We've heard a lot about technologies that do not serve and are not in support of democracy or anti-democratic in form and in practice. I think a lot of us have always assumed that internet technologies were not inherently liberatory, they always had affordances. But what is a democratic technology? What does it actually mean?
So I have the great pleasure of teaching about 120 undergrad students every fall. And I teach a class called Defending Democracy in a Digital World. So it gives me a chance every year to try out this idea with a whole bunch of 19-year-olds. And the idea that I'm generally trying to get across is that you can't have a functioning democracy if you don't know what's happening in the world. You can't have a functioning democracy unless you can get together with people and make plans and try to make change. And you can't have a functioning democracy if you, as an individual, feel like you can't make a change in the world. What's been so interesting, I think the reason there's been so much fear, maybe even despair, at an event like this, is that the landscape is shifting so rapidly. So much of what we expect to be able to get from mainstream journalism, news about what's going on in the world, is being threatened by AI, is being threatened by the erosion of business models. A lot of these spaces where we got together and tried to make change, movements like Me Too, movements like Black Lives Matter, those spaces have become explicitly partisan and captured by political actors. And I think there is a real feeling of helplessness for a lot of young people, and frankly, a lot of people our age as well. So this is a moment where we have to look at those three functions of the public sphere: knowing about the world, talking about the world, acting on the world, and think about whether there are ways to build technologies that give us more control.
Have you seen technologies that do that?
Well, I might actually have a slightly different definition.
Please do.
Or expand on it. And I think I think we have, because I'm not so much here as the red team as the alternative team, because I think we can build technologies
Maybe
that
the
do
green
that.
team.
The green team. For me, I think two dimensions of what is democratic tech that I think about are what affordance do we have personally? Do we have agency? And some of that is in what Ethan talked about. But then also, as a society, can we choose our own destiny? And I think when you think about the previous era, the current era of social media, the use of AI to manipulate us to kind of shape what we think has just been so tremendous in taking away agency. And it's not just that we are being manipulated, but we also don't understand the way that it works. And so I think personally, looking at what could be a next era of more democratic tech, how do we build more transparency in some of the ways Joshua just talked about, and agency into the AI era, that we can see how are these decisions being made? We can make choices between what systems we're using. We're not locked into the level of vertical integration that we're in right now. So some of those are some of the things I would look for. Mm-hmm. And then as a society, a big part of it actually ties back to the economics of the technology, even more than the technology itself. In that, we're in a world where we as Canadians, and I'm Canadian, I live here, but most countries in the world don't control their own economic destiny in relationship to technology. Mm-hmm. I mean, these companies on the West Coast of America are bigger and more powerful than the British East India Company ever was, than the Dutch East India Company ever was. They have that kind of reach. And we can't set up our own social media companies or our own AI companies in the current paradigm, or at least we don't choose to. And so I think another piece is building a economics of technology, and I think open source can help with some of the economics piece of it that allows us to shape our own destiny.
So there's kind of an anti-colonial approach or framing,
I
thinking about how to move away from this space. No, that's great. But so here's a quick question, though. What has actually worked in the service of participatory governance? Maybe we can learn from our immediate past and say, this was actually this was a positive force. This was an affordance that we really want to see more of as we think about what we're going to build next.
So I think one of the most important distinctions to draw is the difference between these enormous networks that are trying to be everything to everybody. And I'm thinking Facebook, I'm thinking Twitter, even before Elon Musk. The idea that everybody in the world should join this particular community, and that it will be where all speech takes place. And I tend to refer to these as big rooms. And big rooms are really useful. You can get ideas to spread in a big room, but governance is always a problem in a big room because people don't agree what the space is for. I want to use Twitter for political organizing. Someone else wants to talk about what they had for lunch. We end up clashing. There have always been small rooms. And small rooms tend to have a specific purpose associated with them. They might be a subreddit. They might be a community of people who decide to spin up a Mastodon server and collectively pay for it and govern it. And there are thousands of examples of people setting up functional online communities. There's two tricks with them. The first is that they require real work. You actually have to commit to them. You actually have to moderate them. You can't farm it out to poorly paid people in Kenya or the Philippines. You actually have to do the work to have the community. The second is that you only know about these spaces if you're part of these spaces. So I'm excited about various different visions of decentralization in which we have many, many more spaces that people have more control over, more authority over, and we actually get to exercise our governance muscles. One of the things I'm a little worried about in today's conversation is that it puts most of the power either on platforms or on governments to come hold platforms in check. There is a third source of power in this, which are the people who are using these platforms, and trying to figure out how to bring those people to the center and envision a different system that's not just structurally different, but is different because we take over the governance role of it. That's what I want to be.
And I don't know if it's the same third source of power or a fourth source of power, but I think there's also the people who build and use alternatives or build and pick alternatives. And I think that's a thing that did work before. I mean, Firefox was something that came to Mozilla before me, so I can sort of look, and I was drawn there because like, wow, look at what those folks did. Mm-hmm. But that and many other open source projects of that era were a set of people with far, far, far less resources than Microsoft, who was the big tech giant of the time, mm-hmm. saying we just want something different and we're going to build it. Or if I'm not a builder, I'm going to go and tell my friends about it. I'm going to install it on my parents' computer. And so I think there is a thing that works, like just in the human spirit. And I kind of still, maybe it's romantic, like to believe in the human spirit of saying we can do it differently. And we can build a different thing that is a little bit more on our terms, and we can choose to use a different thing. And I think to kind of tie that back to the bigger societal choices, I think we can also make those choices, and we rarely do, as societies to build something different and to do something different. I mean, I think if you think in this country, we chose to have our own media system to some degree, despite a hugely powerful, globally colonial media system next door. And we use a mix of public and private means to do that. I think the models we need today to have sovereignty over our own tech economy, how tech influences our society, our democracy, our culture, are going to be different. But I think we have to do that same thing now.
I mean, the original promise of the internet was connection without permission. And this idea of permissionless systems and permissionless action, direct action, boycott, restriction, stepping away from the machine that asks us to act in a certain way is still available to us. And I wonder maybe we can spend a little bit more time about that because we haven't really touched on that yet today.
So if we were going to sit down and, maybe rather than going to the party this evening, sit in a corner and come up with an agenda for how we're going to fix social media.
Why can't we do that at the party?
Do that.
It's probably going to be a little bit loud, but as long as we can find a quiet corner, I'm up for it.
No, everybody at the party.
Yeah. Fair enough.
It's a hack fest even.
So, step one, Frank's right on this. Decentralization has to be a key piece of this. You can't have giant trillion-dollar corporations that have that much power and influence over speech. Step two, and let's nod to our friends who are just on stage, transparency. Auditability. You need to be able to look at these systems. You need to be able to study them. You need to be able to figure out what's going on with them. The third is user control of one fashion or another. And we haven't talked very much about this. This is things like middleware, where you can put software in the mix and try to get a better experience out of things. So I think about someone like Tracy Chu, who really didn't like the level of harassment she was getting on Twitter and ended up building Block Party. So she had much, much stronger tools to deal with the misogyny that she was facing. I look at something like Tournesol, which is an amazing project that's happening in France, trying to get groups of people to work together on collective recommendations on top of YouTube. The trick with this is where we do need the enabling environment. Right now, if you're taking on any of these projects, they're incredibly fragile. Tracy's project basically got 86'd when Elon decided that he was going to charge $42,000 a month for access to the API. My work in building alternative clients bumps up against legal barriers all the time. Thank God I have Jamil and others who are sort of backing me up on the legal side of it. But the fact that I have to go and litigate for the ability to do that I want to do makes it incredibly challenging to do. And as we'll talk about in a moment, those three strategies, which took us 20 years to figure out, right? We've had social media for 20 years. We're going to have to figure out how to do all of those three things with AI, how to decentralize, how to study it, and how to build the tools to give us more control over it. And it's not clear that that's going to work nearly as well with AI as it does with social media.
Well, I guess that's a question of where should we push ourselves. I think if you accept that the architectures of today, and I both mean the technical architectures, but also the economic architectures, are the ones we have to work with, then you might want to just say, I'm only going to regulate, I'm only going to push back. But if you can imagine, we want to decentralize, we want user agency, I think we want those things. What are the different architectures? Let's go hard after those. And so, I mean, I'll also throw out examples. There's a company in the Mozilla Ventures portfolio called Flower AI. They're a federated learning company, which just is a kind of simple version of that is basically letting there be, computing on the edge, on your computer, or, learning across multiple computers. There's lots of ways you use those kind of technologies that are distributed. That is not produce the state of the art right now, but it gets closer and closer. So they're training a closer to state of the art federated learning based LLM. So, pushing ourselves on alternative architectures is a key piece of this. And then I think the other thing to really, question in the techno-economic model of it is vertical integration. And so we assume that if I'm a Google customer, I'm using all of Google Stack. If I'm an Apple customer, I'm using all of Apple Stack. If I'm a company or a government using Microsoft, I'm using all of Microsoft Stack. And I think we can push against, as an interoperability nerd, you're very much on this page, push against the vertical integration paradigm as we have this opening that the switch from the web era to the agentic era creates. And I think there's a chance of winning.
So what is the technical and financial ecosystem and infrastructure needed to get in place to make the organizations and the projects and initiatives that we currently look at, that we acknowledge are fragile, whether they're startups or whether they're communities that are building tech, to make them less fragile, to get learning from them, and to start to make them something that's more durable and perhaps scaling in a different way, scaling at the level of communities, at the level of political interests, rather than at the level of technological kind of giganticism.
But I think they also could scale in a pretty big way. I think we should shoot, small and beautiful, but also big and bold.
Yeah.
And so one of the answers is countries. There's probably some wrong-headed thinking about sovereignty when we talk about technological sovereignty right now. Although I think the impulse in it of we don't want to be reliant on America for our whole economy in Canada or in Europe or anywhere else applied to tech makes sense. But I think the idea that, the general idea of independence does make sense. Independence doesn't mean build it all yourself, own it all yourself, shut off from the rest of the world. It means doing what Joshua talked about of finding your allies, people who want to build or keep open economies, democratic countries, and building a tech stack. And we have a lot of the pieces already as open source. Building the tech stack as open source that we can use to run our businesses, to run our countries, to really have something that is competitive. So I don't think it has to be small, but I think the political will to invest differently and have a third way is really, really important. I will also say that that's one part of it. I do think a kind of a world of double bottom line companies, smaller startups. Tracy is also, one of the people in the Mozilla Ventures portfolio is critical. There are a lot of very mission-driven startups in the world that could be a part of this.
I mean only scale differently. I don't mean
Yeah,
necessarily.
yeah.
scale.
I'm sorry to push back on your.
So
It's good.
another piece of this is you need a number of things to work in parallel. So let's look at Article 40 on the DSA, right? So we've got this great idea that researchers can essentially say, here's the systemic risk associated with a major social media system. We need to be able to understand this so that we can understand the social consequences associated with it. As everyone said, not only do we need good law, it's good law, you need good regulation that gets us through it. You're going to need, good judicial systems that deal with the challenges associated with it. But let's add another element to this. In the United States, where I live and work, people who are working on questions of mis and disinformation are getting harassed by the US Congress. We are getting systemically doxxed, where our Judiciary Department is publishing our pictures and our university affiliations so that people can come after us because we are supporters of the censorship industrial complex. We're going to need a crop of people who are in safe environments to do this research, who have the legal environment to be able to do this. And we need to very heavily invest in that, not only around these existing social media systems, but around these future AI systems. The great news about this moment in time is that we've just had 20 years of watching our public sphere transform by big tech. We know how this is going to go wrong. It will go wrong in some interesting new ways because AI is a very unusual and hairy beast. But these predictable ways that it has gone wrong will go wrong with an agentic internet or an AI internet or wherever we want to go. Let's go ahead and actually build those infrastructures. Let's not just pass the law, but let's build all of those systems around it so that transparency can be real and meaningful. And we need to do that same work around interoperability. You can't just pass the law, you have to enforce the law, you have to get the law firms that are going to do the public interest law on it, you have to fund the companies that are going to end up building the middleware and along these lines. We've got to do all of those things simultaneously because the adversaries in this have literally trillions of dollars at their disposal.
I was just thinking as you were talking, Ethan, about a time in which we imagined ways to expand democracy through technological innovation. Deliberative democracy approaches, the kind of careful application of certain kinds of technological, like civic tech, like a half a dozen years ago at Berkman Center, civic tech was all the rage, and like expanding the pool of activity, and just how far away we've moved from that conversation in some ways. And do you think, is there any hope for that? Or where does it live somewhere in the back of your brain?
So
What's
it
going
does.
on?
So it's hard for me, having suffered the slings and arrows of 20 years of trying to make social media less awful. That's the other course I teach, by the way. In addition to defending democracy in a digital age, I teach a spring course called Fixing Social Media. And we've been doing that for 10 years and we haven't fixed it yet.
Keep
but
working.
I plan on it. I work very, very hard. So in addition to being terrified about where we're likely to go with AI, there are aspects of AI that I'm genuinely excited about. My friend Eric Gordon over at Boston University is doing some wonderful work on this idea that AI might help us listen at scale. One of the things democratic governments need to do is to try to figure out how to listen to people. And most of our methods of it are lousy. Like polling is a very weak method of listening to public opinion. Voting is a very weak method. It would be great if we could actually find ways to listen to public comments, to listen to public meetings, to actually summarize things in ways that we could get inputs out of. You and I, Ivan, have worked together for 15 years on Global Voices. We worked together on a project trying to amplify the voices of people in the Global South using digital media. One of the things I'm very worried about right now is AIs that are so dominated by the West, by the United States in particular, that we end up with even more of a cultural collapse. We end up with some sort of a global monoculture or maybe a biculture between the English-speaking world, the Chinese-speaking world. I'm really interested in how AI could help our friends in Madagascar not only get a way to have great translation between languages, but some sort of a Malagasy AI that is incorporating tradition, that is incorporating points of view. So I think there are things that we can do with this, but we absolutely have to find off-ramps from the positions that we're on right now. The mainstream path on this wants to serve billions of users. And that's the only way that it can justify trillions of dollars in valuation. But those aren't great systems for most of us. You mentioned when we were talking about this before, the notion of the craft beer internet, right? We've ended up with, whether it's the Budweiser or the Molson, we've ended up with some, watered down, good for everybody, but not very good for anyone. We need to figure out how to have some diversity within this. We need to figure out how to have, in social media and in AI, multiple points of view, all of which can coexist, and all of which we actually have the ability to move between and choose between.
And I think, to me, that's a key, is looking at how we build diversity, economic diversity, cultural diversity, and you don't get that without giving people agency and control over their own destiny. And so I think these things are tied together, and they're tied together in really deep ways, like you talked about, and they're also tied to just dealing with a changing global economic setting. If I have that resilience and diversity of options in terms of where I can go economically with tech or with other things, I'm able to survive these changes. And I would say, I don't know that we use the language of civic tech, but a lot of what we've been talking about is both still going strong when a lot of what we talked about when we said things like civic tech, going strong and adapting to this kind of environment. So if I think about just that example of languages, I mean, the core AI models that are out there are, I don't know what piece of research this was. It's something that our team shared with me. They kind of work really well in 50 languages, which sounds like a lot. But Africa alone has 2,000 languages. And so, thinking about, how do you actually let people shape and drive technology in their own culture? Well, we have a project called Common Voice, started or has a big component around African languages. And it's basically like a Wikipedia for AI voice training data sets. The communities can build their own training data sets, train open source models using those. And you see that used, not only across a lot of African languages, smaller language groups like Welsh or Basque, pick up that, basically the Common Voice system because they want to have technology work in their own language, in their own culture. So I do actually think there's a really vibrant world out there of people building alternatives. And the last example I'll say, because I do think it's one as policymakers and people who are thinking about alternatives in tech you need to pay attention to, is there is a growing swell of the research community of small startups trying to build a truly open source alternative. Not the Llama open source alternative, not the DeepSeek Quen Chinese open source alternative, but a real full stack set of open source alternatives to the core mainstream large language models. And so you see that, there's 10,000 GPUs sitting in the Swiss supercomputing center. A bunch of European academics have started, have come together and released a model that from the data to the training code to the weights to everything is open. You can interrogate it, you can adapt it, you can change it and fork it anywhere along the process. So a lot of the spirit that was civic tech, I think, is out there in people building alternatives.
And just coming back to Common Voice for a second, there's something wonderfully decolonizing about that project, because rather than going out and ripping off everyone's writing and artwork and so on and so forth, it turns out that if you invite people in to give you samples of language, and if you do it in a fashion where you say, we actually want you to co-create this with you, people sign up to do it rather than trying to sue you.
Yep.
And it is really interesting to sort of think about whether we can put another model on the table, which is what would happen if we actually got asked rather than having our contributions taken from us, and find some way to participate in these systems rather than trying to regulate them while the horse is well out of the barn.
And the thing that we've also seen in that, I think that's exactly right, is some people are like, well, I'm happy to contribute, but actually I want to take your open source software and own my language. And so it doesn't always lead to open source. I mean, a lot of it is about how you create options for like deep cultural sovereignty and ownership. So Common Voice evolving into a platform where people can say, I want to contribute to the commons publicly, or actually, and that, where we saw this first is a bunch of folks who work on the Maori language saying, this is our language. And so they forked the Common Voice software and built their own data sets and have different licensing around it. Yep. And so creating a diversity of technical, cultural, economic models that people can shape their own destiny, like it's possible.
We did a lot of that work with Mayan communities, people who thought of their language as cultural heritage and did not want it to be exploited or wanted to control access to its use and outputs. Where do we go from here, though? What's going to happen next with this work, though? Like, how do we turn these kinds of opportunities that I think we've all recognized into something that is re-knitting our epistemics in a way that actually does serve a durable democracy, let's say a 30-year horizon. Why 30 years? Because we hopefully will be lucky enough to live that long, so maybe we'll see it. But just so that we're not endlessly stuck into these hype cycles and boom and bust moments in which the kind of fundaments of what we think of as I hate the word civilizational is complicated, but I'll put it there, that kind of can it be a fundament for the way we build forward over the next 20 or 30 years?
I don't know that we ever get beyond hype cycles and boom and bust moments. I actually and I don't even know if you want to. No, but I mean, they are cycles, right? And so it's much more about what do you do with them. And so I think we've learned things from the last 20, 30 years, and hopefully if we're all students of history, from many epochs of technological innovation, that when there's an opening, and I do think there is one right now, in all of the chaos, maybe even partly because of all of the chaos, those are the places to kind of redirect things for a period. And so I do think that, Mozilla, Linux, Wikipedia redirected things for a period. We created a commons, we created an opening, and then there's enclosure, and then the kind of Tim Wu book on how open swings back and forth is about that. And I think you always have to be fighting for diversity, building for democracy. Like, having alternatives is not a one and done game. And so, like, I actually think the hype cycle and the chaos of right now, as much as they scare the shit out of me, also create opportunities to build alternatives where we take the wealth created by the tech economy back into our countries outside of the US and China, times where we can create, different technology where we're more agentic, where we have more choice, a moment where we create a commons of this. I mean, Joshua was talking about this technology as really defining a kind of a next era of humanity, I believe, and he and I don't always agree on this, but, having a set of open source things that we all control so we can all have agency in where it goes. I think we have an opportunity to do that, and that creates more of a chance of a different future. There will always be struggles over power. There will always be booms and busts. But, like, how do we use this moment now to do something different as a counterpoint for how it will just play out if we sit back?
For me, one of these questions is, how do we redirect a hype cycle, right? So I have no question we're in a hype cycle. There's a lot of people who've offered the critique of the circular economy in which, you raise money in which to buy chips, and then, you pass money on to the data centers and so on and so forth. This is a hype cycle that has been successfully ridden by real estate developers and electricity providers and hardware providers. What it has not been particularly well ridden by is folks who are trying to build alternatives, in part because there is this dominant narrative that the only way to make any progress around AI is by spending $100 billion as table stakes. This would be a great moment to try to learn from the 20 years that we've sort of figured out around social media. What are the critiques that really have teeth? What are the interventions that actually look promising? What can we look at now in the AI cycle and say, I really wish we'd figured that out 15 years ago around social media? I think one of the big things is that you have to ensure that there are multiple viable models for doing things. You have to have multiple alternatives, and you have to have the ability to sort of switch between those things and choose between those things. That's going to require some legal restructuring. There are actual policy things that we have to do. But maybe more than that, it's going to require some sort of a boom in people saying, wow, I really dislike the way this new vision is shaping up. I need to put something forward, which is a vision that I can affirmatively get behind. And for now, that's where I think we don't have enough hype. I would actually love to see an outpouring, not just of the sort of concern and despair that I think is very reasonable at a gathering like this one, but these questions of knowing what we know now, looking towards ideal futures. What are the sorts of things that we want to build that are consistent with our values and our aspirations?
I think there is more concern and desire, worry of the kind you're talking about in terms of the hype cycle, and desire to do something different than gets spoken out loud. And so I think that's one of the things to think about. I mean, I was the top AI advisor of the head of a European government, and saying like, look, we don't all have to be dependent on American technology. Like, as a Canadian, as your country, as whoever else, half the stuff we need is already out there as open source. And if we pool our money together, our compute together, we could have an independent alternative. And the answer to that is like, give me the blueprint. And I think the desire for something different, whether it's the public's frustration with social media or governments wanting to make sure they have economic and technical sovereignty and can keep the wealth, the creativity, to themselves, or at least have some of it to themselves, but not rely on the US. There is a lot of opportunity out there for that. And the question is, how do we get brave enough to say it, and even more importantly, do something different?
So we have to be brave enough to say it. We need a blueprint, and we need something like a Congress to support collective action, a counter Congress to support collective action and build. That's to summarize your points. Am I getting that right?
I'm with you on the first two. I don't know how well we can.
Congress.
Well, I think we need to work together, but I don't think deliberating about this. I mean, that's what we're all good at as academics and policymakers, and I think we need to go and do some shit in an open way where if you do something great, I can use it. If I do something great, you can use it. I mean, that doesn't solve all of it, but I think we need to build something different.
So a blueprint, building shit.
I think two other things that I would add to that. I am all in favor of building shit. It is something that I've been doing for 30 odd years. You need people to support that environment. And we're spending a lot of our time right now on counterpower. We're not necessarily spending our time seeding alternatives associated with this.
Absolutely.
So there has to be a way of creating, whether it's an entrepreneurial environment, whether it's an activist environment, active ways of funding that. There also are structural pieces of this that have to come into play. I haven't seen a solution to interoperability that does not require government to come in and say, no, you're going to have to do this. I wish I agreed with some of Frank's hopes that we would put this out in the market and these things will rise to the top. What you're finding in your work with Blue Sky, what I'm finding in my work with Mastodon, is that we're getting those small groups, but what we really need is something that's able to interoperate with everything that already exists. We're going to need help from the regulators and from the legislators to get to that environment.
Final thoughts?
I mean, I think this is a really opportune time, I've said it before, for us to imagine a third way and something different. And I think it's possible to build. We have pieces of it, both already built and as models from the previous era in terms of open source, in terms of stuff that actually gives us choice and agency. And certainly as we have these conversations, we're having one here for 30 days in Canada around what direction we take AI. I hope we actually make some pretty simple but bold decisions to just do something differently.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.